Welcome to the legal podcast containing legal questions and answers in layman's language. Today's topic is asbestos exposure. Well, hi, I'm John Deary, and I am so delighted to welcome our expert guest for today, who is Pat Timmins. Pat is an attorney, as a veteran lawyer in handling many asbestos exposure cases in New York, New Jersey, Florida, and he is now a freelance asbestos exposure attorney. And we're delighted to welcome Pat. So nice to have you here.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
Great. Let's start really by what are the requirements essentially for an asbestos exposure case?
Well, you know, asbestos exposures have been going on for 50, 60 years. It's really amazing. And it's an insidious disease in the sense that when you get exposed, it doesn't manifest itself as a cancer for like 30 to 40 years later. So the requirements are to have primarily pathology by a medical hospital or a pathologist that says there are mesothelioma nodes. And usually I'm going to start with mesothelioma. We want to talk too about lung cancer and asbestosis.
Sure.
But with mesothelioma, essentially that is a disease of the pleura, which is the lining of the lung. And what happens is fibers that somebody breathed in 30 years ago in the 70s, 50 years ago, never were expelled from the body, and they attached to the pleura, which created scar tissue and then turned into a malignancy. So it takes a long time for this to manifest itself. So mesothelioma is the only reason I said it's insidious and dangerous is because you don't know you might have it for 30, 40, 50 years. And so in order to qualify to get into a New York City or New Jersey cluster, they call it. It's not a class act, it's just a cluster done by 3 times a year, 2 times a year in some places. You have to have the pathology that says you have mesothelioma. So most pathologists know that reading from a microscope and after they take a biopsy. So that's the number one thing. You have to have some medical evidence. Then you have to have your own exposure years. You know, and we've had many times where we couldn't find anybody who worked in, computers or something like that, and we couldn't find where the exposure came from. But you keep digging around because it's the only known disease that comes from asbestos. Mesothelioma is a signature disease for asbestos exposure. And that's why this litigation's gone on and on and on. It can never be dismissed like some of the cigarette cases have been. So you need certainly the pathology, you need the work history. It's good if you have some x-ray evidence as well that shows nodules or shows some various plaques on the x-ray. So it's a big big issue with families because most families don't know a thing about it. They haven't heard about it. Maybe their doctor will tell them about it, but for the most part it's a very kind of chilling and scary situation for one of the family members and the whole family.
You made reference to many years. You mentioned up to 50 years, but why does it require so much time in order to have a litigated case?
Well, it's the problem is that the disease doesn't manifest itself for sometimes 15, 25, 35, 40 years. So there's nothing to bring. If somebody's feeling good and there's no case to bring. You have to have an injury, as you know, before you can bring a case. And then it strikes, and it's unfortunately, it kind of strikes, in the middle of retirement or at the beginning of retirement. And that's a sad story when it happens, but it's because the disease itself doesn't show itself for many years.
You're talking about mesothelioma, and related to that may be lung cancer. So those are malignancies.
Yes.
And the question is, would someone that was exposed to asbestos for years get a disease other than a malignancy?
Well, you can get something called asbestosis. It's very rare nowadays. The only symptom of asbestosis is shortness of breath, and that in and of itself is a scary thing. But in certain courts, they won't entertain those cases. It could be complications, emphysema, or some other issues. Primarily, the courts entertain lung cancer, which is a tough case to file and to win, because most of the time someone has a lifetime history of cigarette smoking. So the asbestos exposure and the cigarette smoking synergistically come together and create lung cancer. And when you have that situation where you have a worker who can say, yeah, I worked with asbestos for 30 years and I smoked for 40 years, it's actually a good case, because you can then argue, and the science accepts, that the lung cancer can also can have two causes: cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure.
I would assume that a large bulk of the cases that you would litigate are in the New York City area. And my question is, are there different criteria if they're non-New York City as opposed to New York City cases?
Yeah, I mean, really what's happened now and in the last 20, 25 years is that primarily the trades, the carpenters, the electricians, the dockyard workers, the plumbers, they all retire and they go down to Carolinas or Florida. So they don't live in New York City anymore, but then they would call us or call me, and we would discuss, but where was your exposure? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I was at the Con Ed Powerhouse. Oh, I was at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Oh, I was just in construction. Up here in the 5 boroughs? Yeah. So then we have a special docket for asbestos cases that have occurred due to exposure in the 5 boroughs. So whereas the plaintiff may live in Carolina and Florida, very few still in the 5 boroughs, but if they are, that's a good case. It all gets filed in Center Street in Manhattan. It has an asbestos presiding judge, and they've simplified the process so that people can get their trials early and not have to wait.
When you say early, let's talk about that. I think that's a very good example you have. Fellow worked at a powerhouse, is now relocated to Tallahassee. And can he then, that person can bring an action in the New York City jurisdiction, is that correct?
Yeah, if he worked for generally the cutoff, he needs to have worked at least 6 months in a New York City work site. And that's all 5 boroughs. That's generally not hard to get, So therefore, he doesn't have to file it in Florida, which is not the greatest state for asbestos cases. It's pretty good, but the best place is New York and New Jersey. So
why would you describe them as the best places, I assume, for the ultimate value of an asbestos case?
Well, I think that the plaintiffs, the jury trials in these cases have been very sympathetic to an asbestos mesothelioma client and have awarded very large jury awards. Whereas in other parts of the country where the cost of living is not as much, they're more tending to award not very much on the mesothelioma case or the lung cancer case. And so New York is like one of 2 or 3 areas that you would want to file your case in. And if it's all upstate, if somebody just worked in Buffalo and no other place, we filed it in Erie County. So we file it in the local counties where we have the exposure. So in New York, it's a good asbestos jurisdiction.
There is a term called B reader. What is that?
So a B reader is a radiologist that has certain credentials that they could read certain x-rays and film and determine, in essence, whether or not someone has plaques, pleural plaques, stomach plaques, and then can make at least the recommendation that this could be an asbestos exposure, and therefore should be biopsied and followed through that way. Because, x-rays are not enough. And there's not many good radiologists who know all the types of injuries that may come from just simple chest x-ray. So these B readers, it's been a kind of a credential that a lot of radiologists have sought.
Must a potential client get a so-called positive B reading in order to initiate a case?
It's interesting. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it used to be, but now since mesothelioma, it's actually a rare cancer. There's about 2,500 a year. But since it's all dependent on a biopsy and a pathology reading, it's not necessary to have the x-ray. The x-ray and the evidence of pleural plaques are really for this disease that some states don't even entertain, asbestosis. So really with lung cancer and mesothelioma, you don't need a B reader on an x-ray.
What would you suggest that a client, having worked, let's say, for 20 years at a utility plant, what should they be thinking about in terms of whether they may, in fact, given that amount of exposure, potentially have an asbestos condition? What should they be thinking about doing?
Well, the first thing is, if they can, some research is good to do about what the word mesothelioma even means. Like I said before, it's a scarring of the lining of the lungs that has turned malignant. So there are some surgeries that they remove the lining of the lung. They've been somewhat successful. But then they have to kind of find the right lawyer, get medical records from their family doctor or whomever did this diagnosis for them, and then get started, because there's clusters, court clusters that open up every 6 months. So you want to make that cluster to get your case in with, all the others that unfortunately have come down with that.
What would you say are the kind of major categories of work that wind up having an asbestos case?
Yeah, it's really expanded quite a bit from, say, the Brooklyn Navy Yard days, but it's still obviously heavily skewed to construction trade, very much. You have dockyard or Navy workers. People in the Navy work below deck in these steam-engined battleships or destroyers or what have you, so they were always breathing in a lot of asbestos that was covering the steam and turbine areas. There's plumbers, electricians, roofers. There's powerhouse workers. Manufacture plants, a lot of manufacture plants that have either closed or paper mills that have closed upstate. You find them in Illinois, but they may have spent their first 10 years working in the city, but then they went to a paper mill or an upstate area. I had 2 cases up in Buffalo about 2 years ago, and they were out of a big power plant up there. I think it was called Erie Niagara Power Plant, and they were basically they drove forklifts and dump trucks and what have you, but they were always around when brakes needed to be changed. And brakes historically have always had asbestos in them, in car brakes, truck brakes, those types of brakes. And they had it right up until the early aughts, so into the 2000s. Some of those companies were still making them with asbestos. And you usually have to sandpaper down the brake before you put the new pad on the holder. So we had a lot of people who are automotive mechanics in any way, even people who did it as a shade tree project at home. They have been exposed without knowing it. And so I would say that then there's just people who work in the trades, whether they get a bystander dosage, like coming from somebody else who works directly with asbestos, or they get it in a take-home situation. In other words, father or a spouse comes home every day. Maybe the spouse goes and washes the clothes every day or every other day, shakes out the dusty clothes, and they breathe in the dust in the house, and they get what they call take-home asbestos cancer. So you got direct exposure, you got bystander exposure, where you're just around other guys using it, but you're not. But the dust drifts.
Sure.
And then you have the take-home exposure. And we even had a case out at Shoreham last year where the one spouse worked at Shoreham for 35 years. He did a lot of help administratively with the auto mechanics and the big trucks and stuff like that. And so he was around those guys all the time. But he would go home for lunch, he would go home at night, and even though he didn't directly work with asbestos, he was a bystander. His wife then shook the clothes, laundered them, and she's the one who got mesothelioma, sadly.
So I was just going to ask, it is possible that wives could, in fact, because of their washing clothes and so on and so forth,
Absolutely.
wind up with a mesothelioma case?
Absolutely. It's called a take-home case for the most part. I mean, sometimes you do get women who've worked on sites or done different things, but a lot of the mesothelioma for women, and it's really increasing, is from the take-home exposure. And I mentioned before that talc exposure now is the biggest trend. In other words, about 12 years ago, there were people, it began with a couple of women who were flight attendants. Back then, they used to call it stewardesses. This
Sure.
is back in the 70s and early 80s. And we found out that that union that governed TWA Pan Am stewardesses, I'm going to use that word for now, required the stewardess to powder themselves 3 times a shift.
Mm-hmm.
So they were using cosmetic talc, and they would get a muff and they powder themselves. And as it turned out, that particular cosmetic talc had asbestos in it as well. So it had talc mineral and it had asbestos mineral, all found in the same mine where they grabbed the talc.
Yes.
So it's been an increasing situation where women, from use of cosmetic talc 30, 40 years ago,
Wow.
have come down with mesothelioma. And
I
so
mean-
now we have all the talc manufacturers in the cases and all that stuff, so. it's-
Who would be, for example, manufacturers of talc?
Well, obviously Johnson & Johnson, they're a big baby powder talc. They have other talcs as well. Colgate Palmolive made Desert Flower and some other types of talc. You have Desenex, you have a lot of the big consumer goods, Procter, they have made talc products through the years. And again, no one knew that was causing asbestos, or that there was asbestos fibers in the talc products, but then it came out because the plaintiff's bar narrowed it down to that's the only exposure it had to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they started buying on eBay old talc canisters or old talc tins and getting it tested, and then it was revealed.
You mentioned before the issue of smoking. Is that a challenge to you when you're doing an asbestos trial?
It's not at all for mesothelioma, because smoking doesn't cause mesothelioma.
Okay.
Asbestos exposure does. But with lung cancer, as we know, lung cancer is caused by cigarette smoking. But the only other known and accepted scientific exposure to lung cancer is asbestos exposure. So there's only 2 causes of lung cancer right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's asbestos exposure and cigarette smoking. There's been a dabbling of other things, fumes here or different chemicals, but the only known and accepted cause of lung cancer is cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure. So if you have cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure, it's not a hard case to get moving.
In your litigation, I think it would be if we could maybe narrow it down to 2 things that are important. One is the positive asbestos diagnosis of a B reader on x-rays, and also something called forced vital capacity. Maybe you could discuss
Yeah, those are 2 kind of readings that have kind of gone with the wind to a large degree, because the only thing that they could be creating is this short of breath asbestosis. And those asbestosis findings have become really minimal. So both of them were really important at a certain time, to have that x-ray reading and to have the vital force capacity impairment, but not anymore. It's really pathology. It's really getting tissue from the lung for lung cancer, or tissue from the lining of the lung for mesothelioma. That seals it. No judge will mess with that. But with these other areas, since you have to argue that it's a shortness of breath injury, that's a hard injury actually to prove. It can only be by observation of a spouse or something like that, or unless they've been reporting that to their doctor for years. So it's not so much a big kind of, it's not big evidence right now, criteria for the asbestos litigation.
What would you recommend to a client who worked, again, we use the example, 20 years for a utility facility? What should they be thinking about doing in terms of approaching an attorney like yourself who is an expert in this asbestos field? What should they be thinking and doing?
Well, if they have the injury from lung cancer, mesothelioma, and much less so asbestosis, they should call your office, call me, and discuss what they're going through. Because a lot of people come down with this disease or these conditions, it's a panicky household for about a month. And then, you know, they hear, oh, you get chemotherapy, you do radiation, you do things like that, and their private doctor will give them treatment programs. But at the end of the day, the life expectancy on mesothelioma is about a year, maybe up to 2 years. There's been some, you know, 5-year people out there, but primarily it goes quickly.
That's an important an important time period.
Yeah, and it's important to call the attorney, talk about it, and then my goal, or any good plaintiff's attorney in asbestos goal, would be to get a deposition of the plaintiff, and that really is, we figure out the work history they have, what sites you were at, what type of products you work. Some people are in the construction industry, they were in powerhouses, they were in a lot of different exposure sites, and we take them down. We know who to sue in those areas, and then what we try to do is plan a deposition so the plaintiff can tell his story in front of all those defendants, which is a good thing for the plaintiff's attorney. We need to hear from the plaintiff in that formal setting, and it's nothing to be fearful of. It's just telling the story of how you worked and what you worked around and what you breathed in each day and what your clothes looked like. So it's an important matter to kind of contact an attorney as soon as you can, as soon as you feel comfortable, and then let the process start, which will really only be the plaintiff in a deposition. And I take care of, and I know you take care of, all our plaintiffs. We don't let any of them get talked to impolitely or anything like that. We handle that so that we then have a transcript of their exposure.
What's your sense over the couple of decades plus that you've been practicing this area? Is there more asbestos litigation now? What is it by comparison to, again, 10, 15 years, 20 years ago?
It's a great question, because mesothelioma has increased. There's no doubt about it, particularly with this talc dimension. Because women now, like I said, they're on an increasing trend due to cosmetic talc and some commercial talcs. The asbestosis has really kind of dissipated a lot. It's either not being diagnosed or people are not having severe symptoms enough to bring it forward. And lung cancer cases are going up. So remarkably, this disease, asbestos cancer, whether it's mesothelioma or lung cancer, has either stayed the same each year or increased. There's been really, unfortunately, less, it hasn't gone down.
Are these individual cases or class action?
So a lot of people believe it's a class action, you put it all together. But the U.S. Supreme Court about 40 years ago said no. The exposures are so unique and so different from person to person to person that it has to be an individual case. So when you come to me or come to you, you're going to have your own docket number, your own individual case, and your own judge. And that's the best way to do it. Everyone's case is special, and they need to be handled specially with their own case, not in a big class that you have to accept certain facts or whatever it is. So that's a very strong thing in terms of justice. With asbestos cancer, you have your own case.
Statute of limitations relative to asbestos cases.
Yeah, the statute of limitations is basically a law that says you can only bring a case within a certain time period, because outside of that time period, witnesses start to die, or it's harder to create the case. So they put statute of limitations on everything: civil cases, criminal cases. And so in the asbestos area in New York, and this is pretty much the same in a lot of different places in the U.S., you have 3 years from the date that you discovered it, not when you were working with it, from the date you discovered it, from your doctor, from something that happened in the hospital. And then if you die, you have 2 years. Your estate and your family can continue to bring a case for 2 more years. So a lot of times we have very few statute of limitation problems in asbestos. When you have it, you know it, doctor has told you. There's been enough advertising on TV or talking about it so that people know they need to talk to a lawyer in order to get a case going. And there's 3 years from the day you discovered it. And usually by the end of that 3 years, you're in trial already, or you've settled the case.
I want to talk about New York City litigation because we touched on it earlier. Are there any unique things that we should be aware of as it relates to filing or time periods or otherwise?
Well, the good thing about New York, like I said, it has 2 clusters. One's in April, one's in October. And it'll take in all the cases where the exposures were in the 5 boroughs. So you could have 60, 70, 80 cases in a cluster by different firms. And the good thing about New York is that once you get it in that cluster, you'll have a case that goes to trial or settles within a year after that cluster closes.
Okay.
So that's a great advantage. It's a very tried and true jurisdiction. It's had many asbestos cases, many cases that have gone up to appeal. So we know all the rulings essentially that have come down. I mean, there's always a little bit of defense companies want to fight on, say, talc exposure. Well, we didn't have it then. Or GE or some of these big companies want to say, well, we didn't use asbestos gaskets or those types of things in our turbines or what have you. So there's always some fighting going on like that. But it's a very good jurisdiction to move the case. It gets the big awards. So consequently, it gets very good and large settlements.
As I recall, there are stages, 1, 2, 3, 3B and 4.
Right, yeah.
Is that an important criteria?
Well, a stage 4 reading with mesothelioma is certainly what it would be. Like I said, once you get diagnosed with it, you have about a year, maybe a little more, 2 years. So they will always stage that stage 4. The staging of a 2 or a 3 was much more so when you were just relying on a chest X-ray,
okay.
and trying to say, you know, hey, it's serious, it's at this level, it's at that level. So it generally any asbestos cancer, lung cancer, mesothelioma cancer, is going to be stage 4.
Is it necessary for an oncologist to give a potential client a life expectancy evaluation?
No. They don't like to talk about that. They like to talk, in my experience, they like to talk about treatment programs, what could be done. They're not talking so much, some will, but they're not talking so much about, you know, how it's a terminal disease and how much you have left. You know, you can kind of read it, but they don't generally give it. The ones who do, pretty straight talkers, and that's probably appreciated by the plaintiff.
I think it's extremely effective and very prominent for you to be a trial lawyer. That's the ultimate of all of us in this legal business. I want to hear about your experience or things that maybe would be important to convey to potential clients. What's a trial like?
Well, the best thing that I can ask a client is, do you have co-workers who worked with you, who saw you work with that type of equipment that had asbestos in, or were around you during these kind of rehab situations in a plant or in a powerhouse? And if they can get co-workers, that makes our job really easy, because it's one thing to have a plaintiff talk about their exposures, but then when you have other people who can talk about it and basically corroborate what the plaintiff said, that's really good. It's good to work closely with the attorneys and the paralegals, have a good rapport with them, because we will need you. We want you to give your testimony in front of jurors. We go over that testimony so you're nice and comfortable. Don't ever let anybody mistreat you. And so getting co-workers is great. Getting good slides of the pathology that said it was mesothelioma from your oncologist. I mean, sometimes I will hire their oncologist to come to court to testify. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I will hire their pathologist to come to court so that we could show the jury all the slides and they can kind of go through it with the pathologist as to how, you know, asbestos cancer is created. we like to kind of get a lot of documentation, and that's our job, not the plaintiff's job, on the company itself and how they used asbestos. I've done so many depositions of executives from whether it's GE or whether it's the 3Ms, the Fortune 100, 200 companies. I had a case where I had a guy from Jamaica, started his own business. He was from Jamaica, he was a mechanic there, and he just worked with foreign cars. That was it. He had been trained on foreign cars in Jamaica, so we had all the BMWs, the Mercedes, all those foreign cars were in the mix because that's all he repaired. He was a foreign car mechanic expert. Mm-hmm. So us having their catalogs back in the 70s and 80s and deposing one of their executives on the history of their use of asbestos in the brakes and what have you, really important. When we put that in front of a jury, that's very persuasive. Because in trial, a lot of it is about facts, but a lot of it is about persuasion. And when you have a persuasive way of presenting
you
the facts,
as the attorney?
The trial attorney.
Okay.
The trial attorney is representing a sick person. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to have the facts, because defense companies, they have a lot of money to spend to defend. They will do at least that. But when you have the facts and when you can persuade a jury, that is a very important issue. And that's one you go through with your client, and hopefully you have enough to persuade.
What has been your experience with regard to the jury's understanding the dynamics of exposure and then illness?
Well, that's really a good question. We have to really educate them early on. We'll do it in jury selection. We'll talk to them about asbestos. You ever hear of it? It's not just pipe covering around the pipes in your grammar school when you were a kid. It's in many different forms. It's in brake form. It's in gasket form. It's in pipe covering stuff. It's in talc. So we try to do a good educational process, be it the voir dire, the questioning of the jurors, or in the openings. We'll go through that. It does require some simplification, which we try to do with slides and different kind of schematics that we can. And we find that at the end of the day, they're able to give a verdict. The cases go on in trial for about 4 weeks, 6 weeks. I've only had one go longer than 6 weeks, but they'll understand what this asbestos fiber is all about and how dangerous it is.
When you're doing litigation, are you representing a single client or a number of clients?
No, most of the time you can consolidate 3 or 4 cases. New York will do that sometimes. Let's say it was 3 or 4 auto mechanics. They'll say, just put the auto mechanics together and go up, because then it's going to be simple and what have you. But a lot of times you don't have that. Mm-hmm. You might have a ex-Navy veteran. You then might have a roofer. You then might have a plumber of just small residential neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So the judge will say, no, they're going to have to be taking notes on each and every kind of exposure. Let's just give you your own trial and go. So it'll depend, but for the most part, it's individual cases. So you just have to represent a poor sick person who's come to trial, who's given their story, and then from there take it and show that it was the defendants that created this.
Pat, I'm very proud of your litigation work, and it's obvious from listening to you that you've got a remarkable handle on the asbestos exposure. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, John. Glad to be here.
I'm delighted. And let me just mention that each month we will have 2 podcasts. The first one is going to run from the 1st of the month to the 14th, and the second one will run from the 15th to the end of the month. So I hope that you enjoyed, and I have no doubt that you did, today's discussion on asbestos exposure, and hope that you'll enjoy watching other podcasts as we go forward. So this is John Deary again, and thank you very much for your time and interest. So long now.